Hello, hello. Welcome back to the She is Mother podcast with Dr. Charleanea. I am guest hosting for this episode. My name is Eric Chang. So we're in week 11 of our series that we've been doing on the first. In this episode, we're talking about your power inventory, how to find agency within your circle of control. So Dr. Charleanea, you had a blog post about this and I read it and I really found it interesting that you kind of sparsed out the things that are not in your control, the things that are in your control, and then somewhere in the middle, what you can influence. But to start off, I want you to share a little bit more about your story. You talk about how you worked at your father's restaurant and how you decided to ultimately leave and how this was really pivotal for you in terms of gaining your own agency. So maybe we just start off there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, Eric, because I feel like this particular life lesson came very early for me in life. Like this was something that I needed to master. I don't know if we ever master. It's a practice, right? But it was something that I learned pretty early because there were a lot of things in my early upbringing that I recognized even as a child, I had no control over. So this was something that was constantly on my mind. And it was almost like a muscle that I needed to, train, because I was often confronted with situations where it was like, well, what do I have control over? Of course, I probably didn't use that language as a child, but I think the accumulation happened. I think I was about 13. I might even be 12 actually. And my father owned a restaurant and it was pretty customary that almost every family member worked in his restaurant. Sure. And when I hit 12, of course, I wanted money and I went to go work in his restaurant and holy cow, was it rough. Talk about toxic environment. This was as toxic as can be. And quite frankly, it was because of my father. My father, I'm going to put it bluntly, was a rageaholic. I mean, he had no control over his anger and his frustration levels, and he would act out. And so what did that look like? These are not exaggerations. I remember one time a plate of spaghetti coming through the service area and hitting a wall, or him yelling obscenities and, putting people down. It was horrible. Mm-hmm. And what I was struck by in that moment, even as a 12-year-old, it was like, okay, I don't like this. I don't feel safe here. I could feel my nervous system just activated, my heart racing, feeling really anxious. And I made a decision pretty quickly. It's like, I'm not sticking around for this. I can't control my father. I can't control what's happening around, but I sure as the hell can control what I do. And I quit. I stopped working for him. I never went back. And, I think that was a really kind of pivotal time in my life where it was like, I actually consciously said to myself, there are things I don't have control over. And one of those things is this dysfunction in this environment, but I do have control over my choices. Sure. And that's where this kind of was born from.
Yeah, that is incredible. And I think something that I came away with is just how young you were. I mean, you were mentioning it, you were 12 or 13, and it really seems like at some point you had to get to a place where you had to put your foot down. I'm curious to know a little bit more about what that ultimately was like when you ultimately decided this is the day that I need to stop. And then what did you even do after that? I mean, like you said, you wanted money and money is an element of agency. So where did you even go from there?
So, it's interesting, in terms of my own personal style, I'm not one, well, that comes later in my life, by the way. By the time I was 17, I did get confrontational. But as a 12-year-old, I don't think I had the courage and confidence to stand toe to toe to my father. He was a big man. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's courage or just wisdom. And so I just left quietly. It's like, this isn't for me. I'm not going to do this. And I just didn't go back. And I often did that. In my life up into that age, because I also recognized as a child, I didn't have a lot of power. Sure. I had power over me and that was about it. And so I guess in today's world, we'd call that quiet quitting, right? It was quiet quitting. I just didn't go back. And I pivoted to, the only reason that I could work in my father's restaurant as a 12-year-old is because it was family, sure. Legally I wasn't allowed to work. I was 12. And so I pivoted. It's like, okay, what can I do? What can I do as a 12-year-old? What are my options? And I pivoted into another line of work. And that was, I got a paper route, and I've made my money with a paper route. And I delivered papers for there were two major papers in Denver. One was called the Rocky Mountain News, and one was called the Denver Post. And those were the options. And I delivered newspapers for the Rocky Mountain News. And I would get up every single morning at about 3:30. My papers would be delivered to me. I would have to roll them and rubber band them and put them in I didn't even own a bike, by the way, so I couldn't even ride a bike with my papers. I would literally carry this ginormous pouch that had a front and a back, and I would carry roughly 120 papers on my back, and I would walk my route. And my route was 3 Denver blocks. And I did that every single morning. And that's how I made my money for quite until about 13, when I moved out of state.
That is fascinating. I am very gracious for the technology that we have. I mean, that's a lot, Dr. Charleanea, to be able to do that as essentially a kid. And something that you talk about too is agency versus power versus control. And it really seems like this was a time in your life where you took the agency, or some may say that you took control over your own life, to be able to be independent, to be able to do the things that you wanted to do at such a young age. Could you sparse those out for us? Especially for people who maybe conflate each of the three together.
Right. And so you talk about control versus power versus agency. I will tell you, in all the work that I do with my clients, this is probably one of the biggest things that we talk about in our work together. And that is, people don't understand this. They don't understand the difference between between these concepts or these experiences. Most of us are actually taught to try to control things. And so when you think about that, what is control? Control is exerting or forcing your will onto something else external from you, whether it's a situation or a person. Now, when you stop to think about it, it's really crazy, because quite frankly, I may burst some bubbles out there. I may deliver disappointing news, and I'm going to just tell it how it is, Eric. We literally have no control over anything that happens outside of us. So that is a recipe for disaster, disappointment, disillusionment, probably depression, all the D's, because we don't have any control. We can't make somebody do something. We can't make a system do something. We can't change the weather. We can't do any of that. And so a lot of people waste a lot of energy on trying to control things that are outside of themselves. So it's a waste of time. How is that different than power? Power is something that is internal. It's an experience that comes from within. It's a sense of the ability to create something, an experience that you desire or that you want. And, basically I use power and agency. They're almost very similar. Power is more of a verb or an energy. Agency is the actual thing that we're describing. So agency, what is agency? Agency is the experience of having the ability to create or make something happen that you want to have happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to be able to sparse that out in my own life too. And I'm curious if you could use some examples in your blog post, whether it's people in a relationship, whether it's people in a job that they're not happy about, or a toxic relationship with their boss. Could you maybe give some examples of work that you've had, or people who you've worked with who've kind of had some struggles in this realm? You mentioned that this is something that you touch on with a lot of your clients.
Absolutely. Yes. And I can give examples. I can give personal examples as well as examples with clients. What I have found when clients are really struggling, they will often come in and say, I'm in this situation. Let's talk about a boss situation, for example. It's pretty common for a client to come in and say, I'm really struggling with this boss. This boss, I've had situations where clients have said, this boss can actually be really harsh and really brutal. And let me give an example of what control might look like versus power, right? Control might be trying to bend over backwards to please the boss. Control might be not addressing an issue. Control might be, trying to butter up the boss. Oh, I'll bring the boss coffee and donuts or something. You're trying to basically manage the boss's behavior. That's control. And like I said, that's a losing battle because we don't know if that's going to work. And what it's doing is it's creating a lot of angst, and you're expending a lot of energy into something that may not change. And so what does power look like in those situations? So power in those situations might be something like, well, my boss has a tendency to be a little bit of a loose cannon, and he or she may say things. And so what I'm going to do, instead of having verbal interactions with my boss, I may put my interactions in writing. I may document those interactions by sending emails or, using Slack channel or something like that, so that it's clear that what's happening between us is documentable. That might be something that you do. Or you might understand how your boss works. Like you might find that maybe these explosions or this harshness is coming from anxiety. And so what you might do is go into meetings where you're prepared, like you are prepared and ready to address any loose issues or those kinds of things that might put the boss at ease a little bit. But again, what you're doing is rather than focusing on your boss's energy or behavior and trying to change that, you're bringing that energy back and going, okay, given this situation, what is it that I have the power to choose or do? So that might be a situation at work. A great example, and I laugh at this because it's so predictable, is when I work with couples, and there'll be a behavior that drives one of the partners crazy. Like, for example, common one. This is a really common one. One partner likes to be on time. And as a matter of fact, a lot of times on time is late for them. And then the other partner is chronically late. And this can create a lot of conflict and a lot of fighting. And so one of the things that I will often say to my client, let's say we're talking about the client who wants to be on time. I say, what do you have control over in this situation? And the client will eventually get to this place of, well, I have control over whether I get there on time.
Right.
I don't have control over making my partner, get in the car at the right time for us to be in time. So what do you want to do with this? Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop waiting for my partner and it creating a fight between us. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm leaving at 9:50. If you're in the car at 9:50, you're welcome to come with me. If you're not, I'm going to drive myself to the appointment. So that's an example there. Situation, I think the biggest one of families. I mean, one of the things that I see time and time again is that our family dynamics can be really influential and powerful. And I often talk about how all of us, the moment we walk through the door of our childhood home or we walk through the door of our parents' home, it's like we become 5-year-olds again. And if we don't have the conscious awareness of that, then we will fall right into the dysfunctional patterns in the family. And so again, you can't control your mom, whether your mom's overly critical and complaining or criticizing your behavior, or you can't control the fact that maybe your mom and dad bicker, or that, your sister or brother keeps, getting you, with some slight, kind of some snide remarks. You can't control any of that. And if you try, it's a losing battle. But what you can do is you can say, how am I going to show up? Sometimes you do things like, I'm going to limit my time that I'm there. I'm not going to spend 2 hours there. I'm going to spend 45 minutes there. I'm going to manage my own reactions. I'm going to show up. I'm going to be calm. I'm not going to let these things get to me. I'm not going to react to those things. So again, you see how the focus changes. You're not focusing on, oh, I wish they'd stop doing that, or I wish this could be different. You're accepting what is, and you're saying, what can I do to be okay and take care of myself in these kinds of situations.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting too that you mentioned is between things that you can't control and things that you can control is this kind of middle layer, which is things that you have influence over or things that you can influence.
Yes.
And in some of these examples, it seems like it's kind of towing the line between these are things that I can control versus these are things that I can influence. I can, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one example that you shared that I think applies is, well, I'm going to leave on time, whether or not you're coming with me. Yes. Could you maybe break down that example, which I would imagine is very relevant to a lot of people in relationships or friendships?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could you break that down? And then also tell us, well, what happens when the person who you're trying to influence doesn't go along with it? Like, what happens when you don't get what you want?
Absolutely. Those are great questions. And I do want to talk about that middle territory about what are the things that I have influence over. And some people confuse this with control because, again, the goal is not to force something or to, put your eggs in somebody else's basket. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is there a way that I can influence the situation by my actions? So, for example, let's talk about I'm actually going to give a different example because I think this is a great example. I remember working with a client who had a partner who did not prioritize health, meaning her partner was significantly overweight, ate a lot of junk food, didn't exercise, didn't have a schedule, didn't get enough sleep, those kinds of things, and it drove my client crazy. And what would happen is my client would nag her partner over and over again. You need to be doing this. You should be doing that. So by the way, nagging is not influence. I just want to make this really clear. But what would happen is she had a really very kind, but direct conversation about why it was important to her. So she said, I want to have you around. You're important to me. I love you and I want to have you in my life. And I worry about the decisions or the choices you're making that are bad for your health. So that's a conversation. And whether her partner does anything about that or not is up to her partner. That's the line. I've gone to the line. I've stated my truth. I've stated my wish, and then I drop it. That's one example of influence. Another example in this situation of influence is being the model for what you want. So, I encouraged my client to, exemplify these things that were important to her. Go to bed at the same time every night, regardless of what your partner's doing. And if your partner tries to talk you out of it, which sometimes happens, you say, this is really important to me. Sleep is really important to me. I'm going to go to bed at the time that I've agreed to myself that I'm going to go to bed, eating healthy, going to the gym. She was doing all of these things. And at no point did she nag her partner or try to control or force her partner's behavior. And what was really interesting is she just went on her merry way and started doing this. And the fascinating thing was her partner started having some interest in it because what was happening is all of these things that she was prioritizing was taking her away from the relationship because her partner was making a different choice. And so her partner, ironically, started to come around. Now, I want to make this really clear because I don't want to pull the wool over our listeners' eyes. It doesn't mean that because you do this, your partner is going to follow suit. It may not happen. And that's not really the goal of this. The goal is you do what you can. You can express your truth and then you model the thing that you want and you let go of everything else. So if your partner chooses to do what he or she's doing, you let it be. That may lead to a different decision. We'll get into that another time. But, I think that's what's really important. And that's the distinguishing factor between what can I influence and then knowing I've done what I can to influence. Then you go to the next phase, which is I don't have any control over this. None. So what is my choice going to be? Is my choice going to be, I'm just going to let it go and this is something I'm going to live with? Or is the choice going to be, I don't want to be in a relationship where my partner doesn't take care of him or herself. And so I may end the relationship. And so it comes back to you again in terms of making choices that are in your best interest or that serve you.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about how you've explained it is it's kind of like what you can control and what you can control is more internal. And then what you can influence is a little bit more external, but you're not depending on it, because then it goes back to, well, I did the things that I could do to maybe influence someone, or this person in a relationship. And now it goes back to me, it goes back internally into, well, this is what I cannot control. Something that you call the Power Pack Toolkit, which is a fun name. But I think it's something that you can kind of just remember that you have in your back pocket at all times when you're experiencing something, when you're in a situation where you just can't control the situation.
Right. Yeah, I do want to talk about the Power Pack Toolkit, because here's what I find. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, Eric, whether I've been doing it under the hat of a therapist or doing this as a coach. There are very predictable patterns about human nature. And this is a big one. Of course we want things to go our way, right? Of course we want the things that we want. That's desire. It's built in our DNA. There's nothing wrong with that. Where we get misinformed or we misunderstand is when we're trying to exert control over things that we have no power over. That's where people get really lost and they get confused. And so something to consider is, being in power. Being in our power, part of being in our power is being conscious. So what I find a lot in the work that I do is how unconscious people are, how reactive they are. Like, for example, going back to the client that I was talking about who was just being driven crazy by his partner's tardiness. I mean, these would create these ginormous fights where they wouldn't talk for a weekend. And it was very disruptive, not only to life, but to their well-being. And in that situation, my client didn't even have the consciousness to go, I don't have control over my partner's behavior, because my client was in reactivity. Reactivity is subconscious. It also, reactivity is often very closely tied to survival patterns. And so we get into this place of almost fight or flight, like, oh my God, this can't be. And we fight it and we resist it. And, we're doing everything we can. And so the interesting part of this is when I said to my client, so what would happen if you drove yourself? It was almost like shocking. Like it was almost like it stopped my client in his tracks, because he hadn't even considered it, because he was so caught up in the reactivity. And so one of the most important parts or steps in this Power Pack Toolkit is pausing and actually naming what is happening, saying to yourself, I'm really angry right now because my partner is always late and it makes me late. And I don't like I don't want people to have a bad impression on me because I'm late. And I want my partner to respect me and all these things, and getting caught up in that. So you recognize that the moment you stop and go, I'm angry, I'm reacting to this, it gives you a moment to be conscious of what's happening. And so once you do that, you ask yourself the question, and I encourage my clients to do this every single time. What do I have control over? What can I influence? And what do I need to let go because I don't have any control? And so at that moment, you go through that. Again, let's use the example of being late. I have control over me getting there on time. I don't have control of whether my partner's going to have their seat in the car ready to go. Okay. What do I have influence over? I can talk to my partner and say how important it is to me. And I can also say to my partner, because it's important to me, I am going to leave on time, whether you're in the car with me or not. That's influence. And then the last part, what do I not have control over? I don't have control over whether my partner is going to get in the car on time to get there. So I let it go. my partner's still getting ready. It's time to go. I'll meet you there. I'm off to where I'm going. And so that's a really good example. I think also what's really helpful is at the end of the day is to review your day. Where did this come up? Because it also builds the muscle. It builds that muscle of awareness, of consciously choosing, of being aware of where do I have power? Where do I not? What can I do? Because as you review it, it's almost like an experience of celebration and completion. I did these 3 things. I feel really good about it. And here was the outcome of it. And I want to make note of that. So when it comes up again, I've got access to that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think it's just a constant reminder of, really the only person that we can change is ourselves. It can feel a little counterintuitive, but it is ultimately kind of free. And that kind of brings me to, how do you be sustainable in this? How do you continue agency as a practice as opposed to just something that you do like once or twice or during times of crisis or conflict with someone?
I think that's a great question. And, I know that I started our conversation off at one point and I said mastery and mastering, and I stopped myself because it's like, you can get good at it, but I don't know if we ever really master it because it's a practice. I mean, think about it this way. Let's say you work out and you go to the gym and you're lifting weights and you do that for about a month and you're like, oh, look, I'm pretty buff. Look at these muscles. I feel really good. And then you stop. You're not going to keep the muscles. They're going to atrophy. They're going to go away. This is exactly the same kind of thing. This is a practice. And the cool thing is, you asked about sustainability. The cool thing about this is every single moment of your life, you have a new opportunity to practice this. And it's okay if 5 minutes ago you didn't practice it, because here it is again. It's going to continue to present itself. And so when something presents itself, what can be helpful is when you feel activated, that's a great time to go, oh, I'm activated right now. I'm going to stop for a second to assess what's happening. What is actually going on for me right now? And in that moment, you can say, oh, I'm going to practice this. I'm going to practice what do I have control over? What can I influence? And what do I need to let go?
Sure.
And you can do that over and over and over again. And it's like working out. The more you do it, the easier it is. And you build that muscle. And so I think it's extremely sustainable because it's in a moment. You're only in that moment, which can be seconds. And you build on that moment by moment by moment by moment. And I think it's incredibly sustainable in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Really, one of your mantras or one of your sayings that you always say is the idea of terrible gifts, and how the things that you were granted, whether it was in your control or not during difficulty, during challenges, can actually be incredible gifts in your present and in your future. And so when we interact with things that we maybe don't have control over, that could lead to things like hypervigilance, perfectionism, people pleasing, what do you say to people who are like, well, I'm just too, messed up, or this is just who I am, and these are the habits that I picked up, in line with this conversation about having power or control or agency?
Sure. Yeah, I do talk a lot about terrible gifts, and as a matter of fact, I'm in the process of releasing a book called Terrible Gifts. Mm-hmm. And terrible gifts are basically this idea that life can, throw some brutal swings sometimes, or some challenging swings, or, the things that we're talking about. At the end of the day, if you really think about this, it can be really frustrating. You can get high blood pressure. You can have all these stress related disorders, because at the end of the day, we're trying to take care of ourselves, right? And so when I talk about terrible gifts, what I'm saying is basically any challenge that is presented in our life. Again, the partner that is always late, that's the terrible gift in that is it's giving me the opportunity to recognize okay, maybe I'm going to learn patience. Maybe I'm going to learn how to let go of things that I don't have control over. Maybe I'm going to exercise agency by choosing what I can do and what I do have power over. And so I think what happens is with terrible gifts, when we recognize, oh, this is an opportunity for me, it helps me grow, it helps me learn, it helps me develop skills. When we look at it from that perspective, we're automatically turning on the switch to conscious awareness of what is here for me. When we're in the place of perfectionism and performing and pleasing, we're actually in a survival pattern that is a reactive place. It's a survival place and often is subconscious. And so this idea of terrible gifts, what we tend to do is when we're met with challenges, we fight it. We react to it. We can get pretty worked up about it. And what I invite the listeners to consider is when you recognize you're in that fight place, that flight place, the survival place of activation, to stop for a moment and go, I'm really activated. What's happening for me? And what can I learn here? Like, what is it showing me? What is the opportunity? And I think that this idea, I think this is a big one. When I think about big life lessons, I think this is a really big life lesson that when you recognize, oh, I can't control over what's outside of me. You said something perfectly, Eric, is that it sounds counterintuitive. There's a sense of freedom. There's a sense of liberation when you go, oh, that's on their side of the street. I can't do anything about it, because you're not carrying that with you. And so when you recognize these as gifts, as opportunities to do something different for yourself, I think it's great. I get really excited about it, actually.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I need to remind myself of all the time, whether it's related to a job search or conflicts with friends or anything, I totally agree that there is something exciting and almost alleviating of, like I can do what I can do, and then the rest of it is not up to me. I think that's been always a useful tool to go back to, or a useful saying to go back to. Before we wrap up, I'm curious to know, if you could tell someone, or maybe it's someone new sitting across from you in the room, maybe they're struggling, about the importance of conscious decision making, what would you say? Like, what advice would you give to people who maybe struggle with this?
Boy, that's a big question. That's a great question, and it's a big question. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. As a matter of fact, I was literally just having a conversation before we hopped on this recording around the experience of people not having self-awareness. Like a lot of people move through the world in this constant state of unconscious reactivity. And when you think about that, when you really stop and think about that, is they don't have any power. Like they're the very thing that they want. At the end of the day, what is it that we want? We desire things that take care of us, that feed our well-being, that fill us up, that give us, sense of purpose, that makes us happy, that makes us fulfilled. And so it's wired in us to have desire and to go for things. Now, when we don't have conscious awareness, it can get pretty messy. It can get pretty sloppy. It can get pretty exhausting, because you're just throwing things all over the place. It's like throwing a dart at an entire wall versus trying to go for the bullseye. And that's what unconsciousness is doing. And so conscious awareness, a conscious decision making, is a really powerful way of navigating through the world, because what it does is it slows you down. It gets you out of that animal kind of reptilian reactive brain where you're not really having a choice. You're not having a choice. It's like your nervous system is choosing for you, or life is choosing for you. So you're getting really far away from the very thing that you're wanting, which is to be the ability to make the things happen in your life that are important to you. And so I think that the conscious decision making, oh my goodness, that's a big one. That's a powerful one. And I don't know if I'm doing a very good job at explaining the importance of it.
Well, I think you are. And if I'm catching your drift, it's kind of like at the end of the day, what so many people want is related to agency and being able to do the things that they desire uninhibited. And yet at the same time, on the day to day and in the nitty gritty, it can be easy to fall into unconscious decision making and choices. Whether it's because of the rat race or because you're stressed out. I definitely know that I fall into this a lot, but that only takes us away from the thing that most people really desire.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think, I think oftentimes in metaphors or images, let's say you're in a car and you're trying to get to a destination, unconscious decision making. If that's the car, what you're doing is you don't know where you're driving. You're picking everybody up along the way. You're going down different streets, and maybe you might get to the place that you want to go, maybe or maybe not. And by the time you get there, you're exhausted. Okay. And you forgot why you're going there. That's a way to think about that. When you're in a place of conscious decision making, you're being very purposeful, very aligned with what's important. I am going to here's how I'm going to get it. And I'm not going to get distracted by elements and variables that don't matter on my pathway to this place.
Absolutely. Yes. I think of that metaphor quite often, especially when I'm in periods of indecision or comparing myself. And it's always a good thing to go back to. I think that's a good place to wrap up. I mean, is there anything else that you want to share before we go into our next or final episode?
I think we covered it. Eric.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.